Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, a podcast in which we discuss imaginary things and all things imaginary in science fiction, fantasy, and I guess we'll just call it the weird because it is its own separate entire thing. Mm-hmm. Tony, my co-host here on the other end of the line, has had a brilliant, fantastic idea, which is that we celebrate Towel Day.
International Towel Day, I think.
We're putting this episode together as a celebration of the legacy of Douglas Adams, but also as a celebration of whales and occasionally dolphins in science fiction and fantasy. And so, Tony, you have a lot of whales in your life. I discovered this when I was reading your notes. You have a lot of whales in your life. So many whales. I thought it was going to be hard to find whales in science fiction. And then I open up our show notes for the week and it's like
all the
pages.
Whales.
It's like a page
oh my God,
and a bit
so
of
many
whales.
Yeah.
It's so many whales.
I love whales.
Subsets of whales in science fiction. Intelligent whales and dolphins from Earth. Space whales in space. Flying whales. Yeah, so there's a lot of whales. And I kind of am just broad strokes here.
Yep. Broad strokes.
What is it about you and whales?
I don't know. I honestly, it was, when I was a kid, the two things I was really obsessed with, animal-wise, were dinosaurs and whales. And the whales kind of went by the...
whale side.
Whale side. when I got older, but I never stopped liking them. It's just, I don't know, dinosaurs were more captivating as I got older, I guess. But I've liked whales for a long time, and I just, there's something that when they pop up, whether they're, reaching from beneath the sea or hopping out of a wormhole in science fiction, I am it's a whale, and it's the best. Whale. So
yeah, because when we started the idea for the show notes, not even the show notes, but the kernel of an idea for the show notes of this show, the only space whale that I knew of was Hitchhiker's Guide whale. Literally, that was the only whale in my life. And then in short order, I encountered Star Trek Discovery's space whale, and in Binti, the what do you call those ship whales things?
Yeah, right. I remember the third fish. Yes, the one that is in Binti, the original Binti. Yeah,
and so now I have two more space whales in my life, which is great. The more the merrier. But I look at your list and I'm like, wow, I haven't even scratched the surface of the available space whales. There's so many.
There's a lot of surface on a whale, and a lot of surface on a space whale. Even more. Even more.
What are we doing scratching space whales? I feel like that could go in a very dark direction. So
it could, but also I think the whales enjoy it most of the time.
Yeah. So I'm here to interrogate you about space whales. And
please.
I thought we should probably start where our notes start, which is intelligent whales and dolphins from Earth. So let's break this down a little bit. What are some of the space whales and dolphins that we're talking about? And what's their significance in science fiction and fantasy?
Well, let's travel back in time.
Okay.
To the 1980s.
No.
So, not that far.
My birth.
Just a little bit. My birth too. Our birth decade. Our birth's decades? Our birth decade? I don't know. When we were born. The decade when we were born. So, there's, and I'm sure that other people have, sketched this out in great detail. I'm gonna be giving broad strokes here. But, generally, there was this push.
Are they breaststrokes?
They are breaststrokes to swim along with the whales. Yes, yes. There were, it was right. The 80s were really when the environmental movements, many different environmental movements were getting their starts, or not necessarily even getting their starts, but really finding a firm foothold. There was a lot of environmental consciousness. What?
Flipper hold.
Flipper hold.
I'm just really slap happy about whales.
That is perfect. That is a good emotion for whales to evoke, I feel.
Okay.
So, 80s environmental movements, etc. As a part of this, both in science fiction and beyond, there was a lot of attention that folks were trying to pay to, okay, if we're really trying to think beyond humans, if we're trying to think of like what more than human looks like on Earth, then we kind of have to get away from this human-centric thought. And the way that manifested was, it manifested in a lot of different ways. And, there was reduce, reuse, recycle campaigns, Arbor Day, planting trees, against deforestation, against ozone depletion, et cetera, et cetera. But there was also, and this is most relevant for us, this idea that you could look on Earth for alien intelligences, and that some of what we thought of as, the strict boundary between human and animal, human being intelligent, animal not, might not be as clear as we had thought. And where might we look for such intelligences? Well, species that are related to us, chimpanzees and then later bonobos, but also in the ocean to dolphins and whales. So it was very much in vogue for a while, especially in the 80s, for all this science fiction to involve dolphins and whales in some capacity, either because there had been a lot of whaling that went on and whales were going extinct, or dolphins were, being projected into the far future as also intelligent. And you see this in properties as diverse as Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, obviously, as Star Trek, as the Uplift series, which was, really big into doing this, in television shows beyond Star Trek, like Sequest DSV, which we are definitely going to take a really campy tour of the 80s. We're thinking about dolphins and whales. So let's talk about some of those for sure. Are there any that you'd particularly like to start with?
Whew, man. I mean, they all sound great, but I know that you always have like endless mineable knowledge based in Animorphs. So do you want to talk Animorphs?
I do. So Animorphs is really interesting because Animorphs kind of caught the tail end of this, right? Animorphs was very much a late 90s, early 2000s kind of thing. But what was interesting about Animorphs is that it was fully based in the present day. Oh, well, what was then the present day? And it was very much like alien science fiction. And it wasn't necessary, it didn't follow the party line of science fiction in that, dolphins were taking their rightful place among humanity when humans went to the stars, which a lot of other things did. Instead, the Animorphs, by virtue of being able to become dolphins, were able to then communicate with other dolphins. Presumably, I don't ever think that happened, but they definitely had conversations with whales. And they go into, when that happens, how weird it is and how the conversation is very much like not in words, more kind of in thoughts and memories, and they don't know how they're communicating. And also the Animorphs themselves lampshade it, and like there's one really memorable scene where they like crack up because they're trying to remember how to act on the information they got from the whale. And when someone says information from the whale, they just like can't stop laughing because they're like, our lives are so absurd. So, definitely worth doing. But I think in that respect, Animorphs was definitely following on from what a lot of other science fiction had established. And K.A. Applegate, who wrote Animorphs, is herself, a professed animal lover. So she would have been aware of the treatment of whales and dolphins, both by environmental movements and in science fiction. So I think that, Animorphs was kind of a distillate of things that had been happening for a decade or two at that point.
Right. And all of this is coming after decades and decades of research, some of it even NASA funded, if I'm right, into animal cognition and specifically dolphin cognition. Yeah. Trying to get dolphins to communicate, dosing dolphins with LSD, like all kinds of crazy. And I mean, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page for that, so I'm not just making that up. But like, there were like significant long-term, high profile, I guess, studies being conducted throughout the 60s and 70s, and then even into the 80s, into are these animals in real life intelligent, and how does that, or does that not, play into our treatment of the natural world? And ultimately, of course, the dolphin experiments ended in spectacular failure in the sense of like they lost funding and or they were covered very poorly in the press, and therefore the public like was very outraged and shut them down. Or, you know, there was that famous incident where, what was her name? Margaret Howe Lovett, I think was her name, was accused of having sexual encounters with the dolphins under her study. And it wasn't, according to the research, true, but the public perceived it as true and then like shut down that particular study very quickly. And so all of the Animorphs is born out of the wake of this kind of very messy, sort of slow but steady devolution in dolphin research, which I find very interesting. We didn't have as much whale research, I don't think, just because it's harder to keep whales in captivity and study them for long periods. But like we know that these animals are intelligent. We've known it for a long time. Right.
What's interesting about those examples and those experiments is that, you know, in part that exploitation of dolphins kind of really fueled the, you know, the furor over their use, because, you know, it was really kind of that transition period between useful animal and, you know, potential intelligence, alien intelligence, human level intelligence, sapience, sentience, however you wanted to frame it. But getting to that point really required that misuse, that abuse of the dolphins, and of other animals as well. But dolphins and chimps were good examples of like animals that were then, you know, kind of, taken back as human or near human intelligence in whatever ways that was being framed at the time. And so their incarceration, their experimentation, their, you know, torture, really, essentially, was seen as much more serious and something that people needed to do things about. And of course, you know, that was true of all animals, of all life that was being experimented on within certain environmental movements. But the exploitation for their intelligence then really, you know, got this pushback, because if they're being exploited for their intelligence, then that intelligence is being recognized. And like, what does that actually mean?
Well, and I've always found it very interesting that, so like the whole backlash against places like SeaWorld has happened in my lifetime. I've always found it very interesting that the argument against the captivity of these intelligent ocean mammals goes like, these animals are intelligent, therefore they think like us, therefore they feel like us, therefore they are worthy of being treated well. Which is a very interesting but deeply flawed assumption. I mean, on all levels, every assumption there is flawed. And I find it very interesting that, like, to contrast something like that, where where we acknowledge that these are intelligent animals, but we take it in directions that, I mean, argumentatively and socially, where it was never designed to go, where science doesn't really follow or provide substantial platform for discussion really at all. Like, that's not the point of the science and the research that's been done, is to create this argument for, you know, anyway. I find it an interesting comparison to take that whole argument and compare it against, say, a science fictional or fantastical work like the Over story, where you take for granted that this entity, whether it is plant-based or not, is intelligent, and that intelligence evinces itself in a bunch of different ways, but it's not that it's human-like that makes it worthy of recognition and respect and good treatment. And I think that if those two are like markers on historic progression in how we portray and try to understand the other, I'm very pleased with the progress we've made, because the argument to, we must empathize with these animals because they think and feel like us, to this is a thing that operates outside of us that happens to be intelligent as well. It deserves respect either way. That seems like progress in a sense. I'm being very disorganized in how I described that.
No, that's great. And I think that that's important because then, that really launched this line of inquiry, that was science-based, that was, fiction-based, that was just, everyday kind of based. Right. There are lots of modes of inquiry into this, but that went beyond, our closest primate relatives to begin thinking about the intelligence of dolphins and whales. And then from there to begin thinking about the intelligences of animals like elephants or octopuses or, and
oh my God,
that gets pushed even further. Like, what is intelligence? Is it just like the ability to solve problems? Is it, and this can absolutely be, its own podcast and thinking about how science fiction explores that. But then, holding it up against a book like you just mentioned, The Overstory by Richard Powers, that, it begins to think about the ecosystem sized intelligences that might exist among plants because they've been around so long, which is also territory that Sue Burke's Semiosis
I was just about to go
explores.
there. Oh my goodness. It's so perfect, that connection.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's also perfect to tie it back to some of the nonfiction that we've been reading outside of the podcast, like Other Minds by Peter Godfrey Smith, which is about, its subtitle says it all, The Octopus, the Sea, and the Deep Origins of Consciousness. You've got books like that. You just read a book, which I'm hoping to dig into here, on dinosaurs.
Yes.
The kinds of intelligence which are out there, it's manifold, and in some ways reality is stranger than fiction, but also fiction allows us ways to tackle reality sideways, like semiosis, like the Overstory, in ways that are really rich. And I think that maybe they're doing the literary equivalent of what some of these whale books and whale movies and whale shows have been doing in kind of very on the nose, obvious, but also kind of goofy way for a while.
Right. And they seem, a lot of them seem goofy and campy in retrospect, but, back when they were happening, especially in the 80s and 90s heyday of a lot of these things, they were really sincere and honest attempts to come to terms with what it meant to have other intelligences on Earth with us and what that would look like in the future, especially, and here we're going to talk about Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, what it meant to then basically eliminate entire intelligent species from Earth due to, the hubris of humans, essentially, overhunting, overfishing. And then, as Star Trek IV puts it, Earth is destroyed in the future because aliens that want to communicate with the whales that are currently extinct in the 24th century, destroy Earth. And so it's up to the premise of this movie, if you have not had the privilege to see it, and I say that
I thought I had, but this
in a bit of a way, but it involves time travel back in a Klingon bird of prey to 20th century Earth so that they can rescue a pair of humpback whales to save the future. So again, strongly recommended, but this idea really at the core of it that the loss of an intelligent species, or a species that we now know is intelligent in whatever meaningful and important ways, is detrimental to both humanity but also to the entire planet. And it was reinforced in, plotted science fictional form via this probe that shows up at Earth, can't find the whales, and proceeds to destroy the planet. So kind of an extreme example, but also I think one of the examples of here's what science fiction was doing with whales and dolphins in the 1980s.
Which is so Star Trek is great too, because we've had Star Trek for a while, and it kind of plots again the progression in how we portray whales in science fiction. So where on the time scale between Star Trek IV and Discovery with its space whale did the Next Generation Technical Manual fall, and what the heck is this thing?
So the Next Generation Technical Manual, if you have not had I'm going to use the word privilege a lot tonight. If you have not had the privilege to check out the technical manual I think there was one for Next Generation, and there was one for Deep Space Nine, and maybe for the original series. I don't remember. I only really remember the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine ones. But essentially, these were the kind of things that if you're really interested in the ships and how they looked and how they were laid out and how they worked, like, you basically got big blueprints of everything and technical explanations in universe, and it was all very cool to look at. But one of the hidden Easter eggs, and I will call it an Easter egg because it never actually made an appearance on screen, but one of the Easter eggs that the technical manual held for the Enterprise D in Next Generation is that it had cetacean tanks. So tanks for whales and dolphins, and according to the technical manual, those whales and dolphins were there to be navigational specialists. They would be better at plotting courses through three-dimensional space than humans, since we only think in 2 dimensions, but whales and dolphins already think in 3 as they're swimming. So they would be well adapted to that. And again, that never made it to the screen. That was never, and part of that was budgetary reasons, for an episodic TV show that already cost a lot to make because it was science fiction. It was just kind of cost prohibitive to show something like a dolphin lab where you would have to have a whole lot of water, maybe some dolphins or something to stand in as a dolphin. That didn't mean that it didn't happen, because on SeaQuest DSV, which was kind of an oceanic counterpart to Next Generation, they actually had a dolphin on that show, which was a member of the crew. So, definitely done in a couple of different ways, but Star Trek does have a history of trying to incorporate dolphins and whales, especially intelligent dolphins and whales, into the way that it tells stories. Yeah.
So until this episode of our podcast, I had no idea that there was such a thing as SeaQuest DSV. And now I am obsessed.
Oh my god, please watch some of it, and just, don't watch the entire thing, because I haven't watched the entire thing, but just, if you can watch a couple of episodes, just, get a sense of what the show is like. It is totally worth it. I'm looking
at, some of the cast photos. Oh my god. Okay, if you're listening to this episode, go and Google SeaQuest DSV. If you've never heard of it, like I had. I mean, I feel like I've been living under a rock every time I talk with you about science fiction, but obviously this is a thing that I need in my life, pronto. So thanks to the library, I'm gonna order the DVDs. There's at least 3 seasons of this shit, so it's gonna go down.
Oh, yes.
Oh my god. Okay, great. Okay, moving on to more whales. Can you make some whale noises for us to celebrate? I sure hope that was space whale for whales in space, because that's the next
exactly
category.
What it was. Yes, it is, and it was. So, let's talk about Trek again. I mean, let's start with Star Trek. Again, like you said, on Disco, we had our space whales in the episode. Fuck, I forgot the name. Something to make the sanest
man go mad.
Yeah, it was that one. The one that we nominated for our favorite episode,
and that we can't remember the full name of ever.
Can't remember the name full.
But it starred Rainn Wilson, and that's all you need to know.
Yeah. So definitely, a nice representation of a space whale. Mm-hmm. I will also note that because Disco is obviously happening now, that season came out within the last few months, space whales are by no means, either space whales or whales in space, I should clarify, are by no means a thing that are relegated only to the 80s and 90s. In fact, because they were so integral to so many folks who were growing up reading about them, you'll find that a lot of people who are reading today, me included, I'm definitely including myself in that, just kind of expect space whales as a background thing. I
always expect space whales.
Right. So when you see them in Discovery, they are there and you're like, oh yeah, space whale. I'm cool with that. So you'll find them in, things like books by Alistair Reynolds or Catherine M. Valente. You'll find them in touchstones of science fiction television like Doctor Who, like Farscape, if you go back to the campy 90s again, like Andromeda. So definitely a recurring trope in science fiction, whether it's on the screen or on the page. I'm sure that all of the science fiction and fantasy video games also are chock full of space whales. I took one look at what potentially was going on there, and I was like, yes, there are many lists. So
they're there.
If you are more a video game person, you will very probably be familiar with the whales of air and space and water that are present.
Oh my god, which is
well.
going to be a great segue into our next section, but let's not go there yet.
Yeah, not quite yet. It's also, you're going to see them on screen, whales in space. But again, similar to how those... right? The Muppets could have done a lot with that, is all that I'm saying. Someday we'll have a
Sputnik just looked at me and went, meow.
Pigs in Space podcast for the future. All right. Anyway.
Yes.
It's easier to do on the page than on the screen because it's expensive to do on the screen. But with that said, for those movies and TV shows that were animated, you could do those sort of fantastic ideas much more easily than you could, before computer graphics really became so cheap and easy to do.
But the two examples you gave in the show notes are Titan AE and Treasure Planet, which I would like to note are both steampunk.
Yep.
So what's with steampunk as a subset of science fiction and fantasy and whales?
That's a really good question, because I would also put things like The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra in there, which definitely have some steampunky elements to them. And I don't know what the connection is there. Like, it kind of, doesn't make sense, other than, for whatever reason, it seems to me like steampunk in general is kind of really interested in titans, in giants, in just like creating these really large things.
Monolithic things,
yeah, and whales fit very neatly into that, whether they are actual whales, whether they are whales that have been augmented, or whether they're, whales that are completely constructed and only look like whales. Because we have examples of all of those, I think, in steampunk in general, but also in both animated and computer-generated and live-action
I find it interesting, though, the kind of triad of animated, steampunk, and whale. Like, what's the common factor between those three things?
Yeah.
That kind of makes this a magic place for space whales.
Yeah, a good question. Perhaps something to consider in the future.
Yes.
Steampunk and whales.
If you have a theory and can deliver it to us in pirate speak, we will feature you on our show.
We certainly will. Oh my god. Please.
Okay, so what do you think, though, like trying to distill down space whales and whales in space as a distinct subset of whales in science fiction and fantasy from our previous category? What do you think makes space whales and whales in space like unique and powerful and a recurring feature of science fiction and fantasy?
Well, I think that one of the things that definitely does that is just, well, on the one hand, whales in space.
I know.
Within the medium of space itself, which is often treated on screen like it is the ocean. So you have ships that are maybe submarines. You have ships that are like ocean-going vehicles, which is something we talked about when we did our ships podcast a few weeks ago.
Yes.
So it makes sense that whales are in that medium, but then to sort of like put the ocean within the ocean. And you're actually bringing whales and dolphins to space inside of enclosed tanks inside of ships. Like that gives, that brings sort of real alien otherworldliness to it. You're kind of in science fiction as you're taking ships, as you're taking stations and creating pockets of livability out in space for, folks to walk around, or if it's, a little more realistic, float around. Maybe there are artificial atmospheres, maybe there's not. But for whales and dolphins, you always see that they have to be within a closed environment. They either have, to borrow Babylon 5's terminology, some sort of encounter suit, or they have to have special quarters. Again, Trek does this time in Enterprise. It has an association of species called the Xindi. One of the Xindi species are the Xindi aquatics. Enterprise was the mid-2000s, so at that point, the CGI was good enough that they could actually render the Xindi aquatics as entirely, computer-generated creatures.
Google
but
save me.
Google do it.
I did it.
You also saw, differences both in how the Xindi aquatics were treated on screen. They were always separate from the other characters because they couldn't interact with them. There was a water barrier there. But you also saw how their ships were treated differently. Whereas most of the ships were smaller, the Xindi aquatic ships were large. They were almost like oceans in and of themselves because they were mostly this thin skin between the medium where the aquatics existed within the water and space, which is this, also this allegorical ocean so often. So, that's whales, that's bringing whales to space. Whales in space, to say what I said a minute ago, space is often treated like the ocean. So it only makes sense that even though there's nothing fucking out there, there's going to be life, swimming in that ocean. So whenever you see, and granted, not every large organism that is encountered in space by science fiction is called a whale or treated like a whale, but for, all intents and purposes, you see something kind of big. Usually it's going to have the general shape of a whale. It's going to be kind of rotund with some flippers, and it's going to be like swimming through space somehow again, even though again, there's nothing really there. But the whale in space, actually in space, that makes its home in space, that floats and flaps and flies through space, is a creature that may be intelligent, that may be not, that may be a function of what's going on out there, that may be not. And that is something that science fiction has also done from, a long, long time ago up through the most recent appearance in Discovery with the whale in the episode whose name we can't remember, with Rainn Wilson.
Yes. I am looking up space whale. And it's like a legitimate preferred search on Google. Star Trek Discovery space whale.
Appropriate.
But I think, isn't it like magic to make the scenic man
right.
go mad? That kind of sounds right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings me to another interesting point about space whales, is they're often imbued with a kind of power, whether it's like in Discovery where they have time travel or time stoppage capabilities, or somehow supreme intelligence or like wisdom of the ages kind of a thing. The space whales often are this mystical other, and I'm curious to kind of get at what makes a space whale as a magical hyper intelligent other different from the alien, which we've talked about also in a separate podcast. What is the deal with space whales as distinct from, but also perhaps providing a great counterpoint to the other and the alien?
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a great question, and something that I was thinking about with respect to what I said earlier about how when I was a kid I was obsessed with dinosaurs and with whales.
Sure.
And so let us collectively think back to Jurassic Park.
Ooh,
and the moment where Grant and Sattler are seeing the Brachiosaurus for the first time, and
that
the music's
wonder.
playing, and that wonder, yeah, absolutely. And in that scene, the wonder really comes from just the unfamiliarity of this dinosaur, this thing that's been extinct for hundreds of millions of years, that they, and by proxy us as members of the audience, never thought that we would see alive. And here it is, recreated for them in real life, for us on screen, in a way that looked by 1993 standards to be very, very real. This thing is moving like we've never seen before. It's doing things we've never seen before. It's basically taking this spot from our imaginations and putting it in the realm of possibility, the realm of, this is allowed as a thing that moves and breathes and makes noises and eats plants and is real. And so, that's really capitalizing, or Jurassic Park in that moment was really capitalizing on that grandeur of the imagination.
Yeah.
I think whales absolutely are capitalizing when they're used both in fiction and, everything from museum displays to whale watching tours are also really capitalizing on that kind of grandeur. The big difference is that whales are real. You can go out right now. Well, maybe not right now, depending on
maybe
where
not
you are.
in Montana.
I can't do this
night.
in Arizona. You can't do this in Montana. But, if you were to go to the ocean and, take a whale watching tour or go to a place where, the whales are migrating or something, like, they are creatures that you could see today or tomorrow or, within the near future. That is a possibility. And so by transposing them into space, whether they're intelligent or not, whether they're living in space or living aboard ships or whatever, it really helps to bring along that sense of largeness, of grandeur in a way that, we can take this thing that we know, or at least know of, and put it into this unfamiliar landscape, this unfamiliar place, and get that same sense of wonder and of awe.
Yeah, and it's, I think Star Trek makes for a great kind of contact point for this, again, or at least Star Trek contains multitudes, It contains the Gormagander space whale, and it also contains, it also contains the, what do you call the sea monkeys? Or not sea monkeys, the thing that powers the spore drive or controls the spore drive. You know what I'm talking about?
The mushrooms, the mycelium.
No, well, yes, but also the, like,
the tardigrade.
The tardigrade, space tardigrade. And so Star Trek takes the thing that is grand and massive and huge on Earth and is really actually quite fragile and kind of shrinks it down a little bit and provides it with magical powers. And it's this one significant actor in the larger scale of Star Trek Discovery. And then they take the tardigrade, which is this tiny, semi-insignificant, depending on who you ask, little creature that can survive a great deal, including exposure to vacuum. And then they blow it up and turn it into this, equally significant entity in the storyline. And I think that provides a kind of a window into the new role for whales in Star Trek Discovery. It's less of the grand and majestic and, like, overpowering awe and wonder feeling that they're going for, and more of the, like, humorous contrast and unexpected bend in the plot that you were maybe not looking for but found, and it's surprising and interesting, but it's not. I mean, I can totally understand why you went straight to Jurassic Park, because I think for many of our generation, the 80s kids, Jurassic Park, Star Trek, a lot of these things that became cultural touchstones and have Easter eggs in Ready Player One are, they became important to us because they made us feel something. And usually it was feeling something huge. Yeah. And Dinotopia was actually one of those things for me as a kid. I mean, I own up to it. I was a sucker for Dinotopia, the television adaptation. And that was because I wasn't allowed to see Jurassic Park. So, this was my Jurassic Park for a while.
Yeah.
And there were other things like that. Books and films and television shows, music too. James Horner, of course, is a go-to for that really emotionally moving soundtrack of all things in your life. And that it moved us, it transported us, it gave us that awe and wonder, whether it was awe as in dread or awe as in, like, overwhelmed by how beautiful a moment is. Yeah. And I think that whales are a great touchstone for that. Yeah. They can also be transformed into something else, but, like, they're tied together in the 80s and maybe 90s as well. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's interesting.
And I want to actually follow up on what you just said about awe being dreadful, maybe, as well, like, being filled with dread, because I think probably the most famous whale in all of Western literature is Moby Dick. And obviously that portrayal of whales is very much dated, to the point that, there's not even necessarily a lot of whale in what Moby Dick is in the book Moby Dick, that it's more this kind of, like, biblical or mythical Leviathan more so than it is a portrayal of a sperm whale that we would recognize today. And yet that, that is not necessarily absent from how whales are treated in science fiction and fantasy today. You know, you have some potential direct translations of that idea, of that feeling. For example, there's an episode of Futurama that is pretty much just a straight send-up of Moby Dick, in which the space whale is kind of treated as something that does inspire dread, that is kind of terrifying. Granted, in a comical way, because it's Futurama, but, you know, it's playing the Moby Dick kind of straight. And then you have things like in the Culture series, specifically in the Culture book Look to Windward, you have these creatures called dirigible behemoth hours, which
that's a great name.
It's a great name. And they are pretty much what you would expect from the name, like they're dirigibles and they're behemoths and they're sours. They're whales. They're giant floating whales in like habitats, but they are, you know, they're so large that they are grand and they're awe-inspiring and everything, but there is also an element of, you know, just of dreadfulness, of like, you know, so large they don't care, so large that, you know, we can't even attract their attention. And when characters do speak with them, and it's been years since I read this book, so I may be slightly misremembering this, but I remember that it was, you know, a big fucking deal when characters would be able to speak with them because they were so outside the realm of, you know, the creatures living on and within them.
Sure. Man, who would have thunk that we would have gone from that to that in the space of 5 minutes? I love it. Right. So before we reach the end of today's podcast, we have another quick category to kind of tear through. And this is my very awkward segue, but let's wrap it up, folks, with a conversation about flying whales. Yeah. What's the deal with flying whales, and why are they a separate category?
Yeah, I was really interested in the way that fantasy and fantastical imagery handles whales, because science fiction, intelligent whales and dolphins are almost solely a province of science fiction. That's not to say that in fantasy you won't find fantasy races that are similar to whales and dolphins, that live in oceans, maybe even that come down from space and look like whales, but you can do so much more in fantasy without worrying about, you know, is this plausible? What is the actual real world intelligence of these creatures? So you get things like in Disney's Atlantis movie or in Fantasia 2000, where you can have floating, flying whales, and those are just things that you can do. There's also, again, I mentioned Avatar: The Last Airbender. I mentioned The Legend of Korra. Certainly, if you look into anime, there's going to be a lot of examples of this. If you look into some Western animation, there's going to be also a lot of examples of this. It's easier to do in animation, drawing, cartooning, however you look at it, however you are looking for it, I should say. On the page, it's also pretty easy to do. There's a book called The Wind Whales of Ishmael, obviously connoting Moby Dick there again, by Philip Jose Farmer. I have not actually read it, but apparently it is one of the best
I've read some of his other stuff, and it's pretty good.
Right. I've read some of his other books, for sure. I just have not read this one. So if you have read this one, and you are interested in talking about some flying whales in science fiction, and especially fantasy, drop us a line on Twitter. Tell us how you feel about The Wind Whales of Ishmael, because that's kind of also just an amazing title. I didn't realize
it's
that
a really good title.
Out loud.
Yeah. And so do you think that flying whales are mostly like stylistic? Is it a thing that we include in mostly visual art forms for stylistic effect, or is it something more than that?
I would actually agree with that. I think that, you know, by no means are all uses of the flying whale purely artistic or purely aesthetic, but again, I think it does this kind of transposition in the same way that is maybe reassuring and awe-inspiring in science fiction, that can just, you know, speak to the bizarreness or the upside downness of what's going on in a fantasy land or a fantasy world, by, you know, taking this thing, whether it's a whale or just something that looks like a whale that should be swimming around in the ocean, that shouldn't be able to exist, and putting it for no reason out into the sky. And suddenly you have, you know, an entirely different, you can set everything on its head much more easily with that kind of aesthetic.
So out of curiosity, as we transition into the end of this podcast, what do you think about closing with Douglas Adams and the Hitchhiker's Guide?
Let's do. It is International Towel Day. This is our podcast to celebrate Douglas Adams and his lasting impact on us and on science fiction in general. So, only appropriate.
So before we do that, let's give all of our information that we need to give to our listeners.
Yeah.
Where can they find us?
They can find us on our website, www.imaginaries.net. If they have anything that they would like to share with us, we are most available on Twitter and would love to hear whatever you have to share. We are imaginary_pod. That's POD pod.
Like a whale, a pod of whales.
Exactly, like a pod of whales. And then you can listen to us on SoundCloud, on iTunes, and on YouTube. And all of our back episodes are going to be up there on YouTube, and you can browse through what they are on our website. Just take a look at the episode guide.
Right. And there's a lot to look forward to in terms of content on our website as well. Tony, you've been doing some video content that you're hoping to post. We also have some reviews going up by the time you listen to this podcast episode. There will be some new reviews. Look for those, including one of the Overstory by Tony.
Yes.
Well, not the book isn't by Tony, but the review is by Tony, and it's going to be great. So you should read it. Anything else that you can think of that we might have missed in terms of boilerplate?
I don't think so.
All right. So, to close with Douglas Adams, shall I just read the section?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Please do.
Here we go. Another thing that got forgotten was the fact that against all probability, a sperm whale had suddenly been called into existence several miles above the surface of an alien planet. And since this is not a naturally tenable position for a whale, this poor innocent creature had very little time to come to terms with its identity as a whale before it then had to come to terms with not being a whale anymore. This is a complete record of its thoughts from the moment it began its life till the moment it ended it. Ah! What's happening, it thought. Excuse me, who am I? Hello? Why am I here? What's my purpose in life? What do I mean by who am I? Calm down, get a grip. No, this is an interesting sensation. What is it? It's a sort of yawning, tingling sensation in my, well, I suppose I'd better start finding names for things if I want to make any headway, and what for the sake of what I shall call an argument I shall call the world. So let's call it my stomach. Oh, good. Oh, it's getting quite strong. And hey, what's this whistling, roaring sound going past what I'm suddenly going to call my head? Perhaps I can call it that wind. Is that a good name? It'll do. Perhaps I can find a better name for it later when I've found out what it's for. It must be something very important because there certainly seems to be a hell of a lot of it. Hey, what is this thing? Let's call it a tail. Yeah, tail. Hey, I can really thrash it about pretty good, can't I? Wow, that feels great. Doesn't seem to achieve very much, but I'll probably find out what it's for later on. Now, have I built up any coherent picture of things yet? No. Never mind. Hey, this is really exciting. So much to find out about, so much to look forward to. I'm quite dizzy with anticipation. Or is it the wind? There really is a lot of that now, isn't it? And wow, hey, what's this thing suddenly coming towards me very fast? Very, very fast. So big and flat and round. It needs a big, wide-sounding name like ow, sound, round, ground. That's it. Well, that's a good name, ground. I wonder if it will be friends with me. And the rest, after a sudden wet thud, was silence. Curiously enough, the only thing that went through the mind of the bowl of petunias as it fell was, oh no, not again. Many people have speculated that if we knew exactly why the bowl of petunias had thought that, we would know a lot more about the nature of the universe than we do now.